as part of its Midwest Regional Endowment Conference held recently at Chicago Theological Seminary, United Church Funds hosted a panel discussion entitled, "What do the Black Lives Matter and Occupy Wall Street movements mean about the economy and our country?"
I am so glad to have this panel together today. We are joined with the Reverend Marilyn Pagán-Banks, who is an ordained minister with the UCC and currently serves as the executive director of A Just Harvest, an anti-hunger organization located in Rogers Park. She is also the founding senior pastor of Namaste UCC, a new church start on the northwest side of Chicago, and assisting as transitional pastor for San Lucas UCC in Humboldt Park. Dr. Christophe Ringer is an assistant professor of theological ethics and society at CTS here. His research interests include theological and social ethics, African American religion, public theology, religion and social sciences, religion and politics, and critical theory. Christophe is particularly interested in African American religion as a site for understanding the relationship of self, society, and the sacred as it concerns human flourishing. And the Reverend Starsky Wilson is a pastor, philanthropist, and activist. He is president and CEO of the Deaconess Foundation, pastor of St. John's Church, the Beloved Community, and co-chair of the Ferguson Commission. Deaconess is a faith-based grant-making organization devoted to making child well-being a civic priority in the St. Louis region. We are also joined by David Klassen, who is the United Church Fund's chief investment strategist. As you learned before, he's both a CFA for us as well as the chief investment officer for the Pension Board's United Church of Christ. So, to start, economic justice is a central tenet of the United Church of Christ. And, I just want to know, is the UCC making a difference? What can we do to deepen our impact? And I'll kick a question to you, Marilyn. A Just Harvest mission has an economic justice component, certainly, to provide the Chicago community with nutritious meals daily, while cultivating community and economic development and organizing across racial, cultural, and socioeconomic lines in order to create a more just society. How does the increasing amount of public discourse on racial inequality impact the operationalization of A Just Harvest dual mandate of meals and organizing?
Well, let me just start by saying that I think that the board of directors and certainly the staff and our partner congregations, we have a lot of congregations that partner with us in this work, really do have the heart to want to do this work. But it has not, unfortunately, eliminated the fear. And Don said it well, sort of the uncomfortableness around conversation around privilege. The issue around economic justice has not been an easy one for our folks to contend with. A lot of our partners come from the North Shore, and again, how to engage in the conversation where it's not personal, it's systemic. It's frustrating because it's like, I'm not trying to make you feel bad, and I'm not trying to point fingers at you. It's a system. And unless you can see your place in that system and use the privilege you have to begin to change that system, then we'll always be needed here. And guess what? We shouldn't always be here. Because then at the same time, there's the pointing the fingers to the same person who's been coming to the kitchen for 15 years. It becomes their fault. They're lazy. We've enabled them.
Right.
Why are they still coming? Don't ask about Mary and why she's still coming. Ask about Saint so-and-so who's helping keep this organization running, and we're grateful, but hasn't moved to the deeper level conversation around economic justice, economic disparity, and how that affects how race is in all of that, right? So now, there's also the whole issue of, well, what does the Black Lives Matter movement, Maryland, why are you running down to Cleveland to the Black Lives Convention? What does that have to do with hunger?
Right.
When we understand that mass incarceration, mass criminalization affects why people are poor and hungry. Most of the guys that I talk to every day, they tell me, I would give up this life if I had a job. So I'm not going to tell them, stop feeding your kids because it's the right thing to do, and I don't have a job, and we don't have jobs. Or when there are jobs, they can't get them because they have criminal backgrounds. And so it has everything to do with it. And again, the space that we're in, those are the people that are there. Not just the people who come to us to eat, who come from 29 different zip codes because we're so close to the L station there, but the ones who are right there this issue is their issue, so it ought to be our issue. Because we can grow the organization, we can change the name, we can put up a new building, but if we haven't necessarily impacted and began to help breathe life into that community, I tell folk I haven't done a damn thing then, you know, and I have nothing to be proud of if that hasn't begun to happen. It doesn't mean it has to happen in my time, but if it hasn't begun to happen, you know, so yeah, it's hard to live out that mission. I think it's there, and I constantly have to remind folks, this is our mission. Feed people while we do this other work.
Right. It reminds me that the personal is political, right? Someone's personal hunger is also a deep political problem, right? And if we're afraid of being political, then we're not going to get to solutions.
The students here are very motivated to deal with economic justice, and I think it comes out of our institutional commitments to social justice. And you have many students who really are thinking theologically about economic justice. Mm-hmm. And I think it is encouraging because they're going to take that into the communities that they serve, not only in congregations, but also in nonprofit work. Mm-hmm. So we're working hard to kind of make sure that we are reflecting intentionally on all the issues that have been mentioned so far, mm-hmm. in creating another generations of leaders that will keep these issues on the front burner. And if I could just give you an example of how we can kind of connect what we've been talking about today in terms of United Church funds to a kind of concrete activist situation. I was doing some work in Nashville when I was pastoring. I was in partnership with SEIU in Nashville. And I was going around to different churches and presenting on the question of low wages. Right? And the political environment was very difficult because in Memphis, they had passed a living wage ordinance. Right? Then the state came back around and passed a law saying that no one in Tennessee can have a wage higher than the federal level, right? Okay. So that's the kind of political environment we were working in. But like many other communities, we started working on a community benefits agreement. This is to say that when corporations come into a city or a municipality and want to set up a plant, that they cannot take both tax subsidies and integrate food stamps and other entitlements into their business model. Right? What we call double dipping. Right. And so when we think about SRI, right, we need the SRI community to begin to challenge corporations and to establish criteria to say, where are you in relationship to community benefits agreements? Okay. And to integrate that into an investment strategy. And then you can go to local congregations saying, look, the work you're doing on the ground, all right, we're also pushing from this end as well. Right? And to begin to integrate that strategically. And I think, you know, thinking theologically, congregations can be a site where they can connect the dots. Right? That's what theology does well.
We talked about earlier about incorporating into policy your beliefs, right? Into our investment policy statements, into our endowment policies. And I wonder if that's a way to be sustained in your efforts as well, to really write it in. Does Deaconess do that specifically, or will you, or, I mean, it sounds like you're operating on it, but have you actually written it into the policy?
Yes, so part of what we're doing is, over the course of the next 6 months, rewriting our IPS, our investment policy statement. Because ours is pretty traditional. We reviewed it just a few years ago and made some updates, right? And it included, of course, the normal screens from tobacco and guns and alcohol and these kinds of things, right? Hadn't pushed it. So where does it get personal, right? It gets personal when I know that one of the most generous families to the work that I've done, I used to be an Urban League CEO, in our community is the Taylor family, leading philanthropic family in the St. Louis region, led by Andy Taylor and Jack Taylor, the founders of Enterprise Rent-A-Car. Well, Enterprise Holdings is also the parent company to the Centric Group and the O'Keefe Group that make money off prison commissaries. So this is where we're pushing it now. So we're not just going to, and yes, we're looking at ESG screening and those kind of things, so these positive approaches, but we also are pushing to say, because we're going to the OCIO model, we're also pushing to make sure there are commitments for our OCIO for building up capacity within black-owned, minority-owned investment managers. Because I've heard enough the stories from former African-American trustees when they tried to get a particular manager in and the person doesn't make it through the investment consultant. Because somehow they're not appropriate, they're not good enough for a whole lot of other folk, but not good enough for our consultant, right? And so we start looking at these teams and we don't see diversity. So this is part of what we're doing as an institution, and it's part of what we're doing in our philanthropic community. 2014, St. Louis was named by Charity Navigator as the most generous metropolitan area in the nation. But we don't invest in black-led organizations. We don't invest in, I'm very intentionally using black-led, we don't invest in black-led organizations. We don't invest in advocacy and organizing work. We invest in nice, clean, cute kids in a classroom. And we lead the nation among racial disparities for young black boys who are sent to out-of-school suspension, which, quite frankly, that initial referral is their first check on the line of the school-to-prison pipeline. So we allow that work because we take big checks from the tailors. We allow that work because we don't embed it in our institutions. We've not troubled our relationship with the Greater St. Louis Community Foundation, which I'm engaged in right now, because they want to house this 25-year racial equity fund, but they're the only major philanthropic institution in the St. Louis metropolitan region that doesn't have a senior manager who's a person of color. Right? So we do it when it's in the business imperative, right? And so I'm slow to use this kind of language that it's in the business imperative, because I believe that we have a responsibility as people of faith and as church to use moral language, right? So I can make the economic argument. I can tell you, and you should know this. Your region loses billions of dollars because of racial inequity. In St. Louis, to make it precise, in the year 2012, our GDP would have been $13.56 billion higher if it were not for racial inequity in income. That's according to the University of Missouri St. Louis Public Policy Center. It costs your region money. It costs your regional competitiveness. We also find ourselves in our region as 43rd, according to a study by Harvard professor Raj Chetty. We're 43rd in the nation in economic mobility. 43rd of the top 50 metropolitan areas. Meaning, when you talk about this, what does it mean for a family's next generation to do better than their parents? That's part of the American dream. That's the promise of progress in the American dream. Then guess what? The theology of the American dream breaks down when it does not deliver on the myth of progress. And that progress has economic metrics. And the question becomes, how are we using our financial resources in a space like this to advance that theology? Because we bought into it. Matter of fact, we've staked the hopes of our institutional churches on it. So what are we doing to advance that? Not just with the dollars we spend off of the endowment. What are we doing with the 95% that stays there? How is that money being used? And quite frankly, is that 95% fighting against the 5% that we're using on our mission? And so those are the screens and those are the assessments that I think we need to consider. And that's something that we, quite frankly, are taking much more seriously, and we're doing it with a little bit of pushback.
I'm just struck by there's a couple ways that United Church Funds can act on this. We can act from the top, right, and say that we want diversity in corporate boardrooms, we want racial equality, and let's put that name there. And P.S. This conversation isn't happening with other faith-based organizations, not around the tables that we sit at together. Right, so money forward, work at the top as well as the bottom, and that brings me to the question of how do we continue to protest the new Jim Crow, right? And how it's hard for me to figure how investors can work around the over-militarization of police. Inadequate housing we can work on, systemic educational inequalities, the cute little children in classrooms, we can work on that. But there are parts of this that it's not as easy for investors to get to, right? So, but Christophe, in a review of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, you point out a central problem that the book grapples with: the invisible punishments and collateral consequences triggered by mass incarceration, particularly of black men. And the invisible punishment of not being able to find work after you've been incarcerated, because you have to check that box, right, that you are a felon. Now we're seeing successful campaigns, right? The Ban the Box campaign to remove that "have you ever been convicted?" And it's happening not only on municipal levels, but also within corporations too, right? How do we internalize these successes? How do we reach for more?
Well, let me use the Ban the Box as an example. And Nashville, Tennessee actually just passed one. I had a chance to work with some extraordinary folks on that campaign. The importance of the Ban the Box movements isn't just in the policy change. It's the communities that you engage. It's meeting families where they're at. People know that the people they love can't find work. And it's an entry point where a vast range of religious organizations, nonprofits, can kind of get on board, right? It's an opportunity to then begin the conversation, to begin removing stigma. And one thing that I think those who have expertise in finance, right, the SRI community, United Church Funds, there is an entire industry built around bonding ex-offenders, right? That employers are saying, well, we can't hire this person because I have to take out additional insurance. So we built a cottage industry around ensuring people who are at risk, right, without a sensitivity to how desperate they are to work, right? So I think we have to challenge that. On the other side, we still have a persistent problem with companies who use prison labor, which undercuts the private sector, right? But yet will not hire those persons when they come out, right? So we need to be able to say, you know, to be a good corporate citizen, right? Not only to use their labor when they're incarcerated, but to use it when they get out. And I think we need a massive conference on what does it mean to be a socially responsible investor in the age of mass incarceration. And to be able to really unpack all of these kinds of layers, because it's very complex, right? We know that universities continue to have their band uniforms made by prison labor, right? So we need to really begin to think through all of these connections because they're there, right? And that's somewhere where SRIs, United Church Funds, can really make an impact, making us aware of how we already are implicated. And before the new Jim Crow became kind of our language of grappling with mass incarceration, when people talk about the prison industrial complex, right, they were getting at this economic aspect, right, which I think is so critical. The other issue is that there's a lot of attention given to for-profit prisons, right, because it strikes our moral conscience. But still, prisons really are public investments. Mm-hmm. So we have to also start talking about what is being done. Well, let me phrase it a little bit more precisely. If people are dying in police custody, it means that communities are subsidizing, right, their own death and oppression through their tax dollars. And we need communities of faith to begin to make that connection explicit, right, as a matter of public witness, and then begin to think about that relationship with our investments, because it says something about who we are, right? So there are a lot of layers to kind of unpack, but we just need to keep making those connections, right, because they're there and they provide actionable opportunities.
How do we couch that the concern of inequity when we're living in the wealthiest time in history?
One of my board members owns a corporation. So when we started doing corporate tax transparency work, we went to talk to him because while he's making some good money, we love him and he supports us, he pays taxes. And so we're telling him we're not attacking corporations. We're not anti-corporation. We're saying publicly traded corporations in Illinois ought to pay taxes, and 2/3 of them pay zero and get rebates and tax breaks, while everybody in this room pays taxes, right? And so it's not about coming after you. Or if we're having a conversation about police accountability. You know, I have a cousin who's a police officer, an uncle who's a police. We're not anti-police. We are anti-police brutality. We're anti a system that doesn't hold police accountable, right? We're anti-terrorizing our communities. And so if you're not talking to folk and really breaking it down so that they understand $15 an hour isn't that much when you think about how much profit is being made. Folk like to look at poor folk as the drain on the economy, and the fact is, if those folks who make money spend the money. You know, we buy things for our children. We're able to send them and, you know, buy new shoes or take them to the dentist. And so the money that we make, if we have the income that we need, we're the ones who support the economy. And so the drain on the economy are not the poor folks who need social services, but the drain on the economy really is the wealthy. Because they put their money up and invest it and all that kind of stuff. But people who are earning a living wage put that money right back into the economy.
We also see that those who have gained the most, and this always happens, the top 1%, to use the language of economic justice advocates here, the top 1% always are the people who benefit from economic recoveries. And so that has happened in our last economic recovery as well. What we have not seen in the last economic recovery is that the philanthropy from those who benefit most has not surpassed their pre-2008 levels. So what's happening ultimately is the people who have gained the most from the economic recovery have not put it back into philanthropy. They've not put into spending, and people at the lower rungs economically are. So what you actually have is poor people subsidizing rich people through the tax code. We're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, and we're talking about Occupy. These are both disruptive movements. And so it may be appropriate for us then, as we talk about shareholder activism, as we talk about SRI, to be thoughtful about disruptive philanthropic and disruptive financial strategies for the sake of a system, or at least consider what it means to be disruptive in our strategies and in our policies for systems that oppress. If we will take these things seriously and take this moment seriously, and we will have a clear conversation about BLM and about Occupy, then we have to talk about how we take up space in places vis-a-vis Jesus turning over the tables in the temple such that no one can be oppressed while he's there preaching, teaching, and healing folk. Occupy, or the BLM movement that seeks to disrupt systems as well. How can we do that with our capital? How can we be thoughtful to do that with our endowments? How can we use these things on an intentional and ongoing basis? I look at examples like Bob Ross from the California Endowment, who will not go a 365-day cycle without choosing a very intentional shareholder activism act with all of the billions of dollars that the California Endowment is sitting on. So where is our witness in that way? And will anybody beat us to the punch? Last thing. The Koch brothers convened a conference on criminal justice reform last month. The Koch brothers. Because they have found, right-wing, conservative, that our current criminal justice system is financially unsustainable and that it's bad government to have mass incarceration is bad government. So they've made an economic argument and begun to convene people around this issue that was in their financial interest that they understood 10 years ago. They know that it's not in their political interest. Will the Koch brothers beat progressive philanthropic institutions to the punch on criminal justice reform is a real question that we ought to sit with.
I want to commend you for having this conversation because I know how difficult it is to have it, but it needs to be had.
A good theologian provokes more questions than they provide answers. And I hope just in the few minutes that we have to just do some theological reflection in the hope that it provokes some questions for you. That's really all I want to do. There's a phrase that I've always used to ground me, and it's called the Missio Dei. Do we have any Latin scholars among us? The Missio Dei. Yes. The mission of God. And in Latin, the word missio means simply to send. So the mission of God is ascending. And the question for any community engaged in mission is, for whose purpose are we built and to whom are we sent in order to do the mission of God? And the man I call my spiritual father, the Reverend Dr. Sam Mann, always invites me, in response to the question, to whom am I sent, to simply listen to the cries. Where are the voices crying out for justice? Now, to be sent is to be present in such a way that a difference is made. And when we talk about, as people of privilege and people of wealth, investing our capital and corporate assets in places that make a difference, in fulfillment of the Missio Dei, then we talk about making clear commitments to be present where the cries are heard and utilizing our agency and our privilege to deconstruct systems that perpetuate the injustices.